All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Writing an Effective Narrative Review from Scientific Publications. My name is Sarah Bronson, and I'm a scientific editor in the department. I'm here to talk about the narrative review article, also known as just a review. We'll explain what an effective narrative review does, how to plan one, and how to write one. Feel free to type questions in the chat box as I present, and I'll try to respond as I see them, or if I don't get to them, I will address them at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on the Scientific Publications intranet page if you would like to refer to it later or share the link with somebody. So what is a narrative review? It's more than a repacking of information. It's a summary, synthesis, or critique of the literature on a topic. A narrative review can tie together a wave of new findings, address a controversy, provide an overview of an idea that has not yet been discussed in much depth, or something else. You may be wondering, why use the phrase narrative review instead of just review? It's to make a distinction from the systematic review. A narrative review organizes and interprets a body of knowledge in an entirely qualitative manner. In contrast, a systematic review answers a precise research question in accordance with a highly structured methodology. Like a narrative review, a systematic review assesses the literature that is relevant to a specific line of inquiry, but unlike a narrative review, a systematic review follows a rigorous and detailed set of rules, such as the Cochrane Handbook, to guide the selection of studies and the analysis of their findings. An effective review is based on a clear purpose, is well organized, brings a fresh perspective, and for all these reasons is something that people will want to read and will draw real benefit from reading. Next, I'm going to talk about each of these steps in planning the review. Talk to the journal editor, define the purpose, audience, and scope, plan and carry out a literature search, use the literature to plan the review structure, and make an outline. Purpose is everything in a review and an early and necessary step in the process of defining the review's purpose is communicating with the journal editor. So before you start writing, communicate with the editor of the target journal to establish and define the review topic. For solicited reviews, the topic should be defined in the invitation. For unsolicited reviews, contact the editor of your target journal and ask whether the review topic and approach to that topic you have in mind would be welcome. And remember, not all journals publish reviews. Many journals have an article category for reviews, but many do not, and even those that do take reviews may be very selective in that category. The journal instructions online should state whether unsolicited reviews are accepted, as well as any limits on word count or number of references for this manuscript category. In short, journals are not interchangeable, most of all when it comes to reviews, so for a review to be assured of a destination, you must ensure that the journal is a fit. Part of the process of deciding what you will write about is not only picking a topic, but also deciding how your review will approach that topic. So the purpose of the review must be well defined. This purpose will guide you through the whole process of putting together the review and must be articulated before you start writing. To figure out your purpose, first identify the need that the review is responding to. Are you writing to discuss recent developments, resolve a debate, answer a question, respond to a problem? The audience is often defined by the topic, but sometimes a review is written to educate an audience about a field they are not experts in. Typically, you're writing for an audience of colleagues in your field, but a review may also be written to transfer knowledge across fields or to be accessible to an audience broader than those in your field. The scope determines the depth of coverage of the topic and which related topics to incorporate. Is your review a useful summary of a large body of knowledge? Detailed, comprehensive coverage? And how do you decide which subtopics to include and which to leave out? Well, the review should not be so narrow that its relevance to your potential audience is unclear, but it should not be so broad that it lacks focus and coherence. Altogether, these elements should add up to a unique and new perspective that aligns with your expertise and with current conversations. Here are some examples of studies with different types of purposes. So on the top, I did that too soon. Okay, sorry about that. The images for the purposes are not showing up, but I'll just read the titles of the screenshots to you. So the top left one is called Immune-Related Adverse Events Associated with Immune Checkpoint Blockade. That's an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that is a discussion of an issue arising from the development and increasing use of checkpoint inhibitors. Another one I have up there is called Reprogramming Glucose Metabolism in Cancer. Can it be exploited for cancer therapy? That is a response to a question whose answers are in the process of emerging. And finally, a causal mechanism for childhood acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And that review takes several lines of evidence and integrates them into a coherent idea. Okay, here you can actually see the screenshots. This is an illustration of some differences in audience and scope. So the top right, electroencephalography and brain oxygenation monitoring in the perioperative period. That's a review of a specific set of practices in anesthesiology in the journal Anesthesia and Analgesia. And that's an example of a specialist speaking to other specialists. On the left is diagnosis and management of rheumatoid arthritis. That's a review written by rheumatologists about rheumatoid arthritis. That's written for JAMA. So it reviews a broad topic in a way that transfers specialist knowledge to a broad audience. And on the bottom, optimal pain management for patients with cancer in the modern era is a review about pain management in cancer written by palliative care clinicians for CA, a cancer journal for clinicians. This is a focused but not narrow topic covered accessibly for an audience of cancer clinicians. Decide exactly what kinds of articles you'll look for before you start looking for them. For example, what study designs, what levels of evidence, what primary outcomes, what databases, what time period. And it's a good idea to keep track of these elements of your search strategy. Some journals might ask that you describe your exact search strategy, including search terms and databases, in the review itself, but otherwise it's often fine to summarize your search broadly and simply. Use the journal instructions and published reviews in the journal for guidance. And for help with your search, ask a librarian. A research librarian can help craft your search terms and search parameters and recommend databases to use. You can also ask the research medical library to perform a literature search for you, for which you should allow about 4 to 6 weeks. The bibliography slide at the end of this presentation will have a link for requesting one of these searches. Take detailed notes on the selected studies to represent the information and insights that are most relevant in each. These notes can become the starting point for your draft. During this planning stage, you should formulate a rough structure for your review, based in part on the themes and patterns you search for or observe as a result of your search. This structure will later become the outline that guides the writing process. You can organize studies according to a planned structure if you have one in mind, according to themes you find, such as different aspects of the review topic, different study approaches, different findings, studies that formed a basis for other studies, etc. Or both of those. Sometimes the best structure for a review will be clear to you from the outset and build from the review's purpose. And other times, you will still be deciding on that structure as you process information and find emerging themes and patterns upon closer reading. You might start with one structure in mind and amend it as you go. To organize and compare different aspects of related studies, consider creating a table in Word or Excel. You can place each study in its own row and each aspect you're interested in its own column or vice versa. This kind of table isn't to publish, but to organize your own thoughts. And later on, I will link to a guide for creating this kind of table. Also, try exploring the organizing capabilities of the reference management software that you're using. To make an outline the main points, paragraph by paragraph if possible. Using the rough grouping of the references you collected, create a detailed outline. Aim for at least one bullet point for each paragraph. The same as with any other well-structured paper, there is ideally one big idea per section and one smaller idea per paragraph. Use headings and subheadings arranged logically depending on the content. Here's a few examples of potential organizing principles. Chronological order, general to particular, common to rare, most important to least important. Make sure that all material under a heading relates back to that heading. This relates to the question of what is the appropriate scope. Headings should guide each section and subsection. Use those headings to stay on track and avoid tangents. Remember that headings can be responsive to the ideas that turn out to be the most important or interesting in what you're writing. They don't have to be rigid in phrasing, and they can even be moved around as the paper develops. This is a lightly modified outline of a review on acute myeloid leukemia by Donner et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine. And sorry, it's cut off a bit at the bottom, but it should say new therapies followed by conclusion. So if you look at this outline, you can see a kind of chronological sequence that reflects the course of management. The first section, disease classification, corresponds to diagnosis. The sections, genomic landscape and prognostic classification factors, correspond to the examination of specific features of the disease, such as mutations. Current therapy corresponds to therapy course, and new therapies corresponds to future possibilities. Next, we'll talk about how to write each part of the review: the introduction, the main text, the conclusion, and the abstract. The first job of the introduction section is to establish the rationale for the review. That is, to flesh out the need or the gap that you identified during the planning stage. Why is the review being done? Is there controversy over the best way to do something? Are there several recent advances that may not be widely understood? Does a new development need to be seen through a certain lens? Like research manuscripts, review articles should explicitly respond to a gap in understanding or a lack of clarity. You should include any background needed for the rationale to make sense to the target audience. Next, you should state the purpose. What does the review set out to do? The purpose should flow logically from the rationale. For example, there is debate, so we will critically assess the various findings and integrate them into some recommendations. Or maybe there are new developments in a certain area, so we will shine a light on them and make sense of them all together. Remember, the purpose statement is the linchpin of the review. It animates the whole thing. In fact, the structure of the purpose statement often will mirror the structure of the main body text. Keep the introduction short. It's common to see introductions a couple paragraphs long for review articles, although your needs may vary. Whereas research articles may need to go over a good bit of background and provide a review of key topics, the introduction for a review article is ideally tightly focused on explaining what prompted the review and what the reader can expect of the review. I'm going to give you a little time to read this introduction to a review. The purpose statement is in bold. So the purpose of the review here boils down to understand the impact of a new development, which is prenatal testing of cell-free DNA in various spheres, the new knowledge gained from the implementation of the new test, the effects of the test in the clinic, ethics, and the next steps. Now, what rationale would you say is presented here? The first 4 sentences describe the emergence and incorporation into standard practice of a modern test. Implied by the paragraph is that the impact of this new and influential phenomenon from a bird's eye view has not yet been sufficiently discussed. Here's another example from the introduction of another review article. This paragraph leads off with the purpose statement: to focus on the body of evidence, epidemiological, biological, and genetic, that has accumulated over the past decade and supports a causal mechanism that is selective for the common or B cell precursor subtype of childhood ALL. And that's followed by, closely related, a summary of the rest of the review. So, in other words, the purpose of this review is interpreting and integrating a body of evidence into a coherent model. An okay review only compiles information, but a good review synthesizes. To quote Hodge's Harbrace Handbook, the foundation of research writing is always the writer's own ideas, which flow from point to point, supported and guided by research. In other words, a review should be more than a collection of summaries. Rather, a review should synthesize an array of findings into one coherent structure, whose parts work together to achieve your purpose. The tools for achieving synthesis include not only summarizing, but also paraphrasing, transitions, and interpretation, as we will discuss. Summarize individual studies by restating the main points in your own words. Summaries condense a larger amount of material. Often, this takes the form of one sentence standing in for an entire study. Why summarize? Summarizing allows you to omit many inessential details and to cover a lot of ground efficiently. To paraphrase a statement from a study, restate the same information in your own words while using about the same number of words as in the original. Do not reuse sentences from other articles. Why paraphrase? Paraphrases present key pieces of information in your own voice. This may feel like a chore when the original wording seems like the best way to say something, but it's worthwhile for a lot of reasons. Paraphrasing lets you emphasize what is most interesting to you, explain something in a way that will make more sense to your target audience, weave information together with the ideas surrounding it in your own writing, or put a different perspective on the same data. And of course, paraphrasing is ethically necessary because you must avoid the impression of presenting someone else's ideas as your own. Therefore, when paraphrasing, do not reuse long strings of words and do not substitute synonyms while keeping the original sentence structure. Instead, try to write a new sentence from scratch instead of pasting the original message and tweaking it. And the bibliography slide will have a link to Scientific Publications webinar on plagiarism. So as you might gather, a skillful paraphrase can take more effort than a summary. Fortunately, in reviews, summarizing is much, much more common than paraphrasing. Here's an example of a summary. This one sentence effectively summarizes an entire trial by stating the essential methods and results. Often, a summary of a study will focus on the key results. In this example, which comes from a review article about the tumor microenvironment in lung cancer, the author summarized a long passage from an original research article. The original is above, followed by the summary, which was also followed by a citation of the original. You don't have to read this entire thing, but if you just look at the colored text, you can see how the summary at the bottom takes information that is spread over a 6-sentence paragraph and condenses it to 2 sentences that preserve a core idea of the paragraph. Here's an example of a paraphrase. There's really good paraphrasing at work here. The sentence structure isn't entirely original, as is the phrasing, and yet the ideas communicated are essentially the same. Another tool of synthesis is transitions. Use transitions to show relationships between passages, such as similarity or contrast, and to help convey your interpretation of the information. Transitions can be phrases or, often better, entire sentences. Interpret each group of findings as a whole. How do the main findings and conclusions agree or disagree? One way to structure the main text is to group related studies in the same paragraph and to write a sentence at the beginning or end of that paragraph that interprets or draws implications from those studies considered as a whole. These interpreting statements both add value to known information and can clarify how specific pieces of information help serve the larger purpose of the review. Then, on the basis of your interpretation of a group of current findings, you can identify avenues for further study. You can identify these gaps either periodically throughout the main text or all in one place at the end of the main text. This passage is from a review that proposes a mechanism for childhood acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Here, the author interprets seemingly divergent ideas in a coherent way. The bolded text conveys the author's interpretation of two complex ideas in just two short sentences. Write a conclusion that matches the purpose. Did the review set out to answer a question? The conclusion should provide that answer. Did the review seek to describe the current state of a specific field? The conclusion should summarize that current state. Was the goal to give a recommendation? Then the conclusion should be presented as a recommendation. Also, make sure the conclusion is based on the presented material. Avoid introducing new supporting material at the very end. The central conclusion statement may be followed by a few sentences that emphasize areas where more research is needed and sketch out some specific next steps. Now, for the abstract of a review is typically unstructured. That is, a single paragraph with no subheadings. If the journal does have any instructions for structuring review abstracts, you should follow those. Even without formal headings, the abstract should still be organized. The reader will always benefit from these common elements: background, the rationale, which may be implied rather than explicit, and the purpose of the review. There are no length requirements for the different parts of a review abstract, unless the journal specifies, but you should make sure the components are in balance and are centered on the purpose. It's common to see passages from the introduction used to constitute almost the entire abstract, which may end up overemphasizing background information and leave the purpose under-articulated, which is a problem because the purpose guides the whole review. The purpose may even recapitulate the structure of the main body text and the key points that the review makes. It's a great idea to provide an explicit and precisely fleshed out purpose in the abstract. It's the best way to give the reader an overview of what's to come. You should also consider providing a conclusion statement at the end of the abstract, especially if the purpose of the review was to answer a question or resolve a controversy. Including the conclusion is helpful to readers who cannot access the full article or want to gauge the take-home message before deciding whether to go on to read the rest of the review. Here's an abstract for a review article that provides background information bolded near the top that logically progresses into a purpose statement, which is bolded near the middle. The purpose statement is then fleshed out into the main points discussed in the review. So I'll give you a minute to look over this. So as we come to the end of the presentation, here are more resources to help you continue to improve your literature review skills. The first two articles are about how to write a literature review, both from a biomedical perspective. The Indiana University link goes to a guide from their University Writing Center on how to synthesize multiple sources, including how to create a table to compare related references. And below that is our webinar on avoiding plagiarism, which contains more in-depth information about summarizing and paraphrasing than I gave here. And finally, the Research Medical Libraries page for requesting a literature search. So, does anybody have any questions? If you have other questions or need further assistance, you can also reach us by phone or email, or feel free to drop by our office in 1MC. And as I said at the beginning, we'll post a recording of this webinar on the Scientific Publications intranet site. I hope that was helpful to everybody. Thank you all for joining me today.